1953. A quiet fishing village on the Shiranui Sea in southwestern Japan. The cats are dancing. And they're not doing this playfully. They're spinning in these tight, violent circles right in the dust of the lanes. They're foaming at the mouth, leaping in these bizarre, convulsive arcs before literally hurling themselves into the harbor to drown. The villagers are just standing by the water, watching this deeply unsettling phenomenon they've started calling the cat dancing disease. They're completely unaware that they are witnessing a dark prophecy. They have absolutely no idea that the exact same thing killing these felines in broad daylight is already making its way right toward them.
The mechanics of this are just brutally simple. See, the cats are dying first simply because they scavenge the discarded fish guts from the bay. They're just the first stop in a terrifying chain reaction.
But humans, we eat the whole fish. And because of that, an unseen poison is methodically working its way right up the food chain, silently gathering in the bodies of the youngest, most vulnerable members of the village.
And before long, this invisible killer starts taking down the adults, the grandfathers. We're talking about men who have hauled heavy nets from these exact waters since they were 8 years old, suddenly finding their hands just freezing up, totally unable to grip the ropes they've held their entire lives. By April 1956, it is a full-blown outbreak. A 5-year-old girl is rushed to the hospital. She can't walk, her speech is incredibly slurred. Within days, her sister arrives. Then the neighbors. Numbness, tunnel vision, uncontrollable shaking. People are literally dropping their chopsticks mid-meal. It's so terrifying that rumors start spreading through this isolated village that it's some kind of blood curse or a divine punishment. Okay, let's dive into what's actually happening here. Right up the coast sits the Chisso Corporation. Now, since the 1930s, this massive chemical plant had been producing acetaldehyde for plastics. This process requires mercury, which unfortunately transforms inside the reactor into methylmercury, which is a fiendishly toxic compound. And for decades, Chisso had just been pouring it completely unmonitored, straight out of their wastewater pipes and directly into Minamata Bay. When the local fishermen got desperate and literally begged the company to stop dumping, Chisso didn't halt production. No. Instead, they built a brand new outlet, the Hyakken Outlet, which simply redirected all that poison out of the immediate bay and into the wider Shiranui Sea. So all they did was actively spread the contamination to tens of thousands of new people. So the poison didn't disappear, it just found new mouths to feed on. And in 1958, the situation takes an incredibly dark turn. Pregnant women in these fishing villages, women who showed absolutely zero symptoms themselves, felt perfectly healthy, began giving birth to babies with catastrophic, profound disabilities. Early doctors were completely baffled by this. The methylmercury was clearly crossing the placenta. But why were the mothers fine? Well, prepare yourself for this biological reality. The mother's body, in an act of horrific self-preservation, actually offloads the poison directly into the fetus. It essentially saves itself by destroying the developing fetal brain, entirely sparing the mother. It is a devastating defense mechanism. And this brilliantly illustrates what researchers at Kumamoto University uncovered. By 1959, they definitively proved that Chisso's mercury was the undeniable cause. The data was crystal clear. The fish and the mud in the bay contain mercury concentrations thousands of times above what could ever be considered even remotely safe. So faced with absolute scientific proof, what does Chisso do? They outright denied the science. They blamed the victims' diet, their poverty, they even blamed unexploded wartime bombs. They went to these desperate, deeply impoverished families with what they called mimakin agreements, which were basically tiny payouts offered in exchange for a legally binding promise to never ever sue the company. And the government, heavily reliant on Chisso for economic growth, just actively looked the other way. Even though the science was completely settled in 1959, an agonizing 12-year gap of bureaucratic silence followed. Think about that. 12 years where the factory just keeps dumping, the cats keep dancing, and the children keep being born.
It actually takes until 1968 for the Japanese government to finally officially acknowledge Chisso's fault. But here's the second massive shocker. This official acknowledgement had absolutely nothing to do with a sudden moral awakening. It happened in 1968 precisely because Chisso's method for producing acetaldehyde had finally become industrially obsolete.
They stopped the factory, and the government acknowledged the crime, simply because they just didn't need the factory anymore. The poisoning was allowed to continue for exactly as long as it remained profitable, not one single minute longer, and not 1 minute less. This brutal realization sparked a massive legal reckoning.
Patients began marching right on Chisso headquarters. And right around then, in 1971, an American photographer named Eugene Smith arrived on the scene. He planned to stay for maybe 3 months, but he moved into the village, he learned the patients' names, and he ended up staying for 3 years to document the fury.
In December 1971, inside a small, dim bathroom, Smith captured what would become one of the most defining images of the entire century. He photographed a mother tenderly cradling her severely contorted teenage daughter, Tomoko, who was born in 1956 with congenital Minamata disease. She had never been able to walk or speak.
That image was published globally, and it was powerfully described as a pieta rendered in the language of industrial atrocity. It basically forced the entire world to look at Minamata. And Chisso's response? They literally hired thugs who cornered Smith at a company facility and beat him so severely they permanently damaged his spine and his eyesight.
So the crucial point here is what happened next. Tomoko passed away at age 21, and decades later, her parents made an unexpected, deeply personal request. They asked that this world-famous, historically vital photograph be permanently pulled from circulation so their deceased daughter could finally rest. And you know what? The request was honored. The icon was withdrawn.
But the disease itself, that was not withdrawn. While thousands are officially certified, the true scale of the horror along the Shiranui Sea actually reaches into the tens of thousands. The slow, agonizing march through the courts has been so relentless that Japanese judges are literally still issuing compensation orders into the 2020s over half a century later.
Today, if you visit Minamata Bay, you'll find a really beautiful public park where local children play. But directly beneath that pristine grass is a massive, sealed landfill. It's a permanent poison tomb holding the deeply contaminated mercury-saturated sediment that they had to dredge right off the seafloor.
The dancing cats spinning in the dust of those lanes back in 1953, they were a warning, a violent, convulsive message proving that what you pour into the water ultimately comes back wearing the face of your child.